the last thing that you need to do with your paper is that you need to include a closing. And typically you've been taught that closings need to include three things. You've been taught that at the beginning of your closing you should restate your thesis. You've probably been taught that within your closing you want to review your main points. And you've probably been taught that the third part of the closing is that you want to leave your reader with something to think about. I often think of this third part as a place where you can show off your writing style. And so I try to teach everybody to set up and follow through with what I would call a colorful closing, something with some pop here. Okay, so these are ultimately the three things that you want to do in your closing. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to focus mainly on this part right here, the place where you set up this kind of cool closing. This is an opportunity for you to show off your writing style. Okay, so let's do that here. So I want to show to you some of these colorful options. The biggest option for the colorful closing aspect of that is to use the pull-through technique, which we talked about the other day, also known as the Forrest Gump technique. So what we've got here is I've got an example of a hook or an opening from a magazine article from Sports Illustrated from several years ago. And so the pull-through technique, as you know, is where you refer back to the hook in the closing of your essay. So this Sports Illustrated article does just that. So the opening, this is the first paragraph of this essay, it's not an essay, excuse me, this feature article that was in Sports Illustrated on a football player. So the whole article is on the Dallas Cowboys, but this is how the article started. It starts off with, when DeMarcus Ware was in grade school in Auburn, Alabama, his mother Brenda bought him a pair of cowboy boots. She made sure that they were 2 or 3 sizes too big because even then there was a sense of how quickly DeMarcus could grow into things. And sure enough, his feet filled them in no time. That should say no time. Let's change that. He wore the daylights out of those boots. Before long, people around town weren't calling him by his name anymore. He was simply known as Boot. Then the next paragraph and several paragraphs and pages of this article transition from DeMarcus Ware into the Dallas Cowboys and how they're going to do during the season, yada, yada, yada. You get to the last paragraph of this article, and it then does this at the end. Now, it's not an essay, so it does not restate its thesis. It doesn't review its main points. It just ends with a colorful closing. And this writer did this by using the pull-through technique. So let's take a look. Okay, so at the very, very end, the last paragraph, he wrote, "The Cowboys, of course, haven't been first too often lately. They last won the NFC East in 2009, and they have just that one playoff win in the last 15 years, 4 seasons ago. But Ware believes that's about to change. It's easy to say at this time of year," he says, "but it feels like everything's in place. The talent, the attitude, it's all there for us to do something special. We just have to develop it. If the Cowboys are about to grow into something big, well, Boot would know." So in this case, you can see that these last couple of lines here use that Forrest Gump technique. It goes back to DeMarcus Ware, who's the person that is mentioned up in this hook. It also goes back to this nickname that he's been given that was identified in the opening. So it's just kind of this cool little way for us to go back to the very, very beginning and end with a bang. Kind of a cool way to end the whole piece. Ultimately, there are a whole bunch of ways that you can end your essay. So the first way, one way, probably the most popular way, is this pull-through technique. But I've got 3 more if you turn your handout over. So for each of these, I want you to realize that you have to include this part right here where you restate your thesis and review your main points. Okay, so I'm going to show you that first. So you should start with by restating your thesis. And I like to use this two-sentence approach. And so you'll see this right here on this one right here. This is a complete closing, whereas number 3 and number 4 are not complete closings. I haven't put in the reviewing your thesis. I haven't put in the reviewing your main points. I've just showed you the stylistic way to close it. So let's look at this one. This is a complete closing. So we're going to restate our thesis or review our thesis here, but we're going to do it in a couple of sentences. Okay? So that's what you'll get right here. Okay. Coming up with one solution that encompasses the entire spectrum of the nation's obesity epidemic is probably impossible. However, a comprehensive plan needs to be put in place before it's too late. Okay, pretty simple. Instead of using the one-sentence thesis that you have in your theme statement paragraph, we split it into 2 sentences. This helps to make sure that you don't just copy and paste your thesis statement here. That is a mistake. Okay? The other thing that is kind of a cool thing that you can do is start this paragraph, as it's done here, with a simple concession. Okay? You may have one in your refutation point, but this is an excellent place to put a concession, as well as to have this right at the beginning of your closing, is to have just a simple little concession. Yeah, it's true that this probably is not something that can be solved easily. However, we need to do something about this problem. Okay, obviously this paper is about the obesity epidemic. Okay, so then we get into the next part where we review our main points. Okay, you can write these things in the margins if you want to. Okay, notice that I'm taking several sentences to review my main points. So you're going to review those negative effects that you have for your topic. So here we go. As it stands, America's children are as unhealthy as they have ever been. They are more likely to face health problems, including disease, heart attacks, and even death. This is probably something that was covered in one of probably the first paragraph, the first body paragraph. The problem isn't helped by the increasing workload of parents necessitated by the economy. The financial benefits of prepackaged, chemically altered foods make staying healthy even more difficult on the consumer. Okay, so this is like 3 sentences that talks about what was talked about in the paper, reviewing those main points. Okay, so you're going to do this with all of your closings. You're going to restate your thesis, and you're going to review your main points. Then you can start using one of these techniques. At the very end, you can use the pull-through technique, or you can do this. Number 2 is use a quote to set up your last line. So don't end with a quote, but you could use a quote to set up a last line that has some pop. So this might be a quote you got from research. So we're back on the obesity topic here. So after we review the main points, yet there is still hope. The national obesity epidemic just might be brought under control before some kids struggling with their weight today even reach middle age. And here's our quote. If we got this way over the last 30 years, says Galson, it's not going to take us centuries to get back. We could reverse things at the same speed or even faster. And then for our last line that has some pop, the trick, of course, will be to learn to love good food even more. Let me try that again. The trick, of course, will be to learn to love good health even more than good food. Boom! Good last line. Usually pretty short last line, something that has some pop. Okay, let's look at a third way that you could end your closing, your whole piece. Okay, again, restate your thesis, review your main points, assume that's up here. This time we're going to use wordplay. Okay, this is a totally different paper, different topic. Okay, now we're going to end it with a little bit of wordplay. It's hard to see how Beijing can stifle the civic impulses of the millions of Chinese who've been stirred into action by the humanitarian crisis. The earthquake, and this is where our wordplay will begin, the earthquake has exposed how much China has changed and given a fleeting glimpse of what might be. The political and cultural aftershocks will roll on for years after the ground has ceased to tremble. Okay? So we've got aftershocks, roll, tremble, all words that relate to the earthquakes that are ultimately what's being talked about in this particular paper. So it's basically using some wordplay for a little stylistic closing, which is pretty cool. Okay? You could also end by answering a question. So use a question to set up a snappy last sentence, which could even be a fragment like we have in this case. Okay? Again, begin by restating your thesis and reviewing your main points. Take several sentences to do that. And then set up your last line. And you can see here it might take a while. Okay? This one's on the performance-enhancing drug thing that I've shown you some pieces to an essay about that. So here is the last couple of lines. It's a truism that baseball involves a lot of failure. Babe Ruth struck out 1,330 times. That's the equivalent of 3 seasons of at-bats without ever putting a ball in play. Ty Cobb, whose .367 career batting average is the highest in history, failed more than 63% of the time. In a sense, most Americans are failed ball players. That is one reason for the sport's unique grip on the nation's imagination and affections. Perhaps more than anything else, performance-enhancing drugs make baseball less of a shared activity. Some might ask, and here's the question, who is really hurt by all of this? The answer is simple. Everyone in the stands and on the field, and Bonds more than anyone. Now this last line relates to Barry Bonds, who is clearly talked about earlier on in the paper, so this thing makes sense. It could even be that Barry Bonds was talked about in the hook, in the opening. If that's the case, we are doubling up here, talk about awesome, where we are setting up the closing with a question and using the pull-through technique. Wow, that's pretty awesome. So this is a place where you can use some writing style. I hope you try out one of these 4 ways to end your piece, and let's try it out, see what happens. Good luck with it. All right, that's all. I'm done. Sorry for taking so long.